I never thought feeding a cat would change everything. It was such a simple request, the kind neighbors make without thinking twice. Sarah had knocked on my door that Tuesday morning, her face drawn with worry lines I'd never noticed before. She was heading to the hospital, she said, some emergency with her mother. Could I please feed Whiskers while she was gone? Just for a few days, maybe a week at most. Of course, I said yes. I'd been living in the apartment next to hers for 3 years, and we'd developed that particular kind of urban friendship where you exchange pleasantries in the hallway and accept packages for each other. She seemed relieved when I agreed, pressing the spare key into my palm with trembling fingers. The metal felt warm from her grip, and I wondered if she'd been holding it for a while, working up the courage to ask. That first evening I let myself into her apartment just as the sun was setting. The space felt different without her presence, quieter somehow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Whiskers, a grey tabby with white patches, greeted me with a cautious meow from his perch on the windowsill. He studied me with those intelligent green eyes, as if trying to decide whether I was trustworthy enough to handle his dinner routine. I found his food in the kitchen cabinet, the same brand my own cat had preferred years ago. The familiar sound of kibble hitting the metal bowl brought back memories I'd thought I'd packed away. As I watched Whiskers eat, I noticed how he kept glancing toward the hallway, ears perked, listening for sounds that wouldn't come. Animals know when something's wrong, I thought. They sense the absence before we do. It was on the 3rd day that I first heard the crying. I'd come by earlier than usual, around noon, thinking I might stay a bit longer to give Whiskers some company. Sarah had mentioned he didn't like being alone for extended periods. As I was opening the front door, I heard it. A soft, muffled sound coming from somewhere deeper in the apartment. My first instinct was to call out, thinking maybe Sarah had returned early. But something about the quality of the sound made me pause. It was too young, too fragile to be her voice. I followed the sound down the narrow hallway, past the living room, where Whiskers was now watching me with renewed interest. The crying seemed to be coming from the bedroom at the end of the hall. I knocked softly on the door, my heart beginning to race for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt oppressive. I tried the door handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily under my hand. The room was dim, curtains drawn tight against the afternoon light, but I could make out a small figure huddled in the corner near the closet. It was a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with Sarah's dark hair and pale skin. His knees were drawn up to his chest, and he was holding his stomach with both hands, rocking slightly back and forth. When he looked up at me, his eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a fear that made my chest tighten. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. I knelt down slowly, the way you would approach a frightened animal. "I'm David. I live next door. Your Aunt Sarah asked me to feed the cat while she's away. I didn't know you were here." The boy's grip on his stomach tightened. "I'm not supposed to be here," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "She said I couldn't stay, but I had nowhere else to go. My mom left me with her last week, and hasn't come back." I felt a chill run down my spine. Sarah had never mentioned having a nephew, never mentioned any family, at all. In 3 years of casual conversations, she'd painted herself as someone largely alone in the world, which was part of what made our neighborly relationship feel so natural. We were both solitary by choice, or so I'd thought. "What's your name?" I asked gently. "Tommy," he said, then quickly added, "But she calls me the burden." The casual way he said it, as if it were just another name, made my stomach turn. I could see now that his clothes were too small, his jeans riding up above his ankles, his t-shirt stretched tight across his thin frame. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his lips looked dry and cracked. "When did you last eat, Tommy?" He shrugged, looking down at his hands. "Yesterday, I think. There's no food left." She said I ate too much, that I was making her poor. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. "Stay here for a minute, okay? I'm going to get you something to eat." I went to the kitchen, searching through Sarah's cabinets and refrigerator. It was true that there wasn't much food, but what struck me wasn't the quantity so much as the deliberate organization of it. There were locks on some of the cabinets, the kind you'd use to child-proof a home, but these seemed designed to keep someone out rather than keep them safe. The refrigerator had a similar lock, though it had been left open. I found some crackers and a can of soup, basics that would be easy for a child to digest. As I heated the soup on the stove, I noticed Whiskers watching me from his usual spot by the window. He seemed less anxious now, as if my presence had somehow normalized the strange energy in the apartment. When I returned to Tommy with the food, he ate like someone who hadn't seen a meal in days. The way he guarded the bowl with his arms, the speed with which he consumed everything, it all pointed to a deprivation that went beyond simple neglect. This was systematic, intentional. "Tommy," I said carefully, "how long have you been staying with Sarah?" He looked up from the empty bowl, soup still glistening on his chin. "Since school ended. Mom said she needed a break, that she'd be back soon. But Sarah keeps saying I'm too much trouble, that I eat too much and make too much noise." "Where do you sleep?" He gestured toward the closet. "She made me a bed in there. Said I couldn't use the couch because I might mess it up." I looked at the closet. Really looked at it for the first time. It was barely large enough for one person to lie down, with a thin blanket and a pillow that looked like it had seen better days. There was a small plastic cup on the floor, presumably for water, and a stack of comic books that looked worn from repeated reading. "Has she hurt you?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Tommy shook his head quickly, too quickly. "She doesn't hit me. She says things. And sometimes she forgets to buy food, or she says I already ate when I didn't. But she's not mean like that. She's just tired of me being here." I felt a rage building in my chest, the kind that comes from recognizing a particular brand of cruelty. It was the kind of abuse that left no visible marks, the kind that slowly eroded a person's sense of their own worth. I'd seen it before, in my own childhood, in the way my stepfather had made me feel like an imposition, a burden on the family's happiness. "Tommy, I need to ask you something important. Do you have any other family? Anyone else who might be looking for you?" He shook his head. "Just Mom and Sarah. Dad left when I was little. Mom says he didn't want kids." The picture was becoming clearer, and it made me sick. A mother who abandoned her child, a sister who took him in reluctantly, and then made him pay for her resentment every day. And now, with Sarah gone, he was truly alone, left to fend for himself in an apartment with locked food cabinets and a hiding place that wasn't even fit for storage. "Listen to me, Tommy," I said, sitting down beside him on the floor. "You're not a burden. You're a kid who deserves to be taken care of, to have enough food and a safe place to sleep. What's happening here isn't your fault, and it's not okay." He looked at me with those old, tired eyes, and I could see the war between hope and self-preservation playing out across his face. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "I heard her talking to someone on the phone. She said if I caused any trouble while she was gone, she'd tell my mom I ran away. Then they'd both be done with me. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Sarah had engineered the perfect trap, leaving him alone but terrorized into compliance, ensuring he'd suffer in silence rather than risk being abandoned completely. It was psychological warfare waged against a child, and it was working exactly as intended. I made a decision that would change both of our lives. "Tommy, I want you to come stay with me until we figure this out, just next door. You can have a real bed, real meals, and you don't have to hide anymore." He stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to process the possibility of kindness without strings attached. What if she comes back and finds out I'm not here? What if she tells my mom? Then we'll deal with that when it happens, I said. But right now, you need to be somewhere safe, and I need to know you're okay. It took another hour of gentle coaxing, but eventually Tommy agreed to come with me. He packed his few belongings into a plastic grocery bag, including the worn comic books and a small stuffed animal he'd been hiding under the blanket. As we prepared to leave Sarah's apartment, I made sure to leave everything else exactly as it was. I filled Whisker's food and water bowls, gave him a few minutes of attention, and locked the door behind us. My apartment felt different with Tommy in it. He stood in the middle of my living room, clutching his plastic bag, looking around with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to get too comfortable anywhere. I showed him to my spare room, which I'd been using as an office, and helped him make up the bed with clean sheets. "This is really for me?" he asked, running his hand over the comforter. "For as long as you need it," I said. That first night I heard him crying again, but it was different this time. Not the desperate, muffled sobs of someone trying to remain invisible, but the exhausted crying of someone finally safe enough to let their guard down. I sat outside his door for a while, just listening, wanting him to know that someone was there without intruding on his privacy. The next morning I made pancakes, the kind with blueberries that my grandmother used to make when I was his age. Tommy ate them slowly, savoring each bite, and I realized he was still afraid the food might be taken away. We sat in comfortable silence, the morning light streaming through my kitchen window, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of being needed by someone who deserved care. "David," he said after finishing his third pancake, "why are you helping me?" It was a question I'd been asking myself since the moment I'd found him. The honest answer was complicated, wrapped up in my own childhood experiences and the adult I'd become in response to them. But Tommy needed something simpler, something he could understand and trust. "Because you matter," I said. "Because every kid deserves to be safe and fed and cared for. And because I can help, so I should." He nodded solemnly, as if filing this information away for future reference. "Are you going to call someone? Like the police or social services?" I'd been wrestling with that question all night. The right thing to do, the legal thing, was to contact the authorities. But I also knew how overwhelmed the system was, how easily a case like Tommy's could fall through the cracks. A child who wasn't technically being physically abused, whose mother might return with excuses and promises, whose aunt could claim she'd been caring for him properly. "I think," I said carefully, "that we should wait a few days. See if your mom comes back. See if Sarah returns from the hospital. Then we'll decide together what the next step should be." Tommy seemed relieved by this answer, and I realized he was probably as afraid of the system as he was of his current situation. Foster care, group homes, the possibility of being separated from what little stability he'd known. These were all threats that loomed larger than the neglect he'd already endured. We spent the morning establishing routines. I showed him how to use the TV remote, where to find books if he wanted to read, how to make a simple sandwich if he got hungry while I was out. I gave him my phone number and taught him how to use the landline, emphasizing that he should call me if he needed anything, no matter how small. Around noon, I went back to Sarah's apartment to check on Whiskers. The cat greeted me with his usual cautious meow, but I noticed he spent more time winding around my legs than usual, as if he too was grateful for the company. As I was refilling his water bowl, I heard the sound of a key in the front door. My heart started racing. Sarah was back, earlier than expected, and Tommy was safely in my apartment. I tried to compose myself to act natural, but my hands were shaking as I finished with the cat's care. "Oh," Sarah said, stepping into the kitchen. "I didn't expect to find you here." She looked tired, older somehow than when she'd left. Her hair was disheveled, and there were stress lines around her eyes I didn't remember seeing before. But there was also something else, a kind of furtive energy that made me uneasy. "I was just feeding Whiskers," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "How's your mother?" "She's—" Sarah paused, looking around the kitchen as if taking inventory. "She's stable. The doctors say she'll be fine, but it was touch and go for a while." I nodded, waiting for her to mention Tommy, to ask about him or express concern about having left him alone. But she didn't. She just stood there, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Well," I said finally, "I should let you get settled back in. I'll continue checking on Whiskers until you're feeling more up to it." That's very kind of you," she said, but her voice lacked warmth. "I appreciate everything you've done." I was almost to the door when she called out to me. "David, you haven't noticed anything unusual around here, have you? Any strange noises or anything like that?" The question sent a chill through me. She was fishing, trying to determine if I'd discovered Tommy without directly asking about him. I realized she probably hadn't expected to return so soon, hadn't planned for the possibility that I might still be coming by regularly. "No," I said, meeting her eyes. "Nothing unusual at all." She nodded, but I could see the suspicion in her face. "Good. That's good." I left her apartment and went directly back to mine, my mind racing. Sarah was back, which meant Tommy's situation had just become infinitely more complicated. I found him in the living room, reading one of my books, and the sight of him looking comfortable and safe made my chest tighten. "She's back," I said without preamble. Tommy's face went pale. "Did she ask about me?" "Not directly, but she knows something's different. She asked if I'd noticed anything unusual." Tommy set down the book and drew his knees up to his chest, falling back into the defensive posture I'd first found him in. "She'll figure it out. She always does. And then she'll make me pay for it." "No," I said firmly. "She won't, because you're not going back there." The words surprised me as much as they did him. I hadn't consciously made the decision, but as soon as I spoke it, I knew it was true. I couldn't send this child back to a situation where he was being systematically neglected and emotionally abused, regardless of the legal complications. "What do you mean?" Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, we're going to find another solution. Together. We're going to make sure you're safe and cared for, even if it means navigating some difficult conversations with adults who should have been protecting you all along." Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Sarah would come to my door occasionally, making casual conversation, asking about minor things related to Whiskers' care. But I could see her watching me, studying my face for signs of deception. She was smart enough not to ask directly about Tommy, but her presence felt like surveillance. Meanwhile, Tommy was beginning to relax into the rhythm of life in my apartment. He'd wake up in the morning and help me make breakfast, though he still ate like someone who wasn't sure when the next meal would come. He'd spend the afternoons reading or watching TV, always keeping the volume low, still afraid of taking up too much space. In the evenings, we'd talk. He told me about school, about the friends he'd had to leave behind when his mother decided she needed a break. He told me about his dreams of becoming a veterinarian, about how he liked taking care of animals, because they never made him feel like he was too much trouble. I told him about my own childhood, about growing up feeling unwanted, and how I'd learned to find my own worth, despite the adults who'd failed me. I told him about my work as a freelance graphic designer, about the freedom of being able to work from home and set my own schedule. "Is that why you were able to help me?" he asked one evening as we were cleaning up after dinner. "Because you know what it's like." "Maybe," I said. Or maybe it's because I wish someone had helped me when I was your age. It was during one of these conversations that I realized the full extent of what I was considering. I wasn't just providing temporary shelter for a child in crisis. I was contemplating a fundamental change in my life, the possibility of becoming a guardian, a parent figure, to someone who needed stability and care. The idea should have terrified me. I was 34 years old, single, with no experience raising children. My own childhood had been marked by neglect and emotional abuse, leaving me with trust issues and a tendency toward isolation. I'd built a life that was comfortable precisely because it was uncomplicated, free from the messy obligations that came with caring for another person. But looking at Tommy, seeing how he'd begun to smile more readily, how he'd started to believe that he deserved kindness, I realized that maybe I'd been wrong about what I needed. Maybe the life I'd built wasn't just comfortable, but also empty, lacking the kind of purpose that came from being truly needed by someone else. On the 5th day after Sarah's return, she knocked on my door in the evening. I could see Tommy tense up from where he sat on the couch, and I gestured for him to go to his room. He disappeared quickly, and I took a deep breath before opening the door. "Sarah," I said, trying to sound casual. "How are you settling back in?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the wine on her breath. "I need to ask you something, David, and I need you to be honest with me." My heart was pounding, but I kept my expression neutral. "Of course. Have you seen my nephew, Tommy? He was staying with me before I left, and now he's gone." The word hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. She wasn't asking if I'd seen him. She was accusing me of knowing more than I'd let on, and the way she said, "gone," suggested she was more angry than worried. "I didn't know you had a nephew," I said, which was technically true. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. He's been missing for days, and you're the only one who's been in and out of my apartment. If something's happened to him, what exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, letting a note of indignation creep into my voice. Sarah stared at me for a long moment, her eyes narrow with suspicion. "I'm suggesting that you might have seen something, heard something, that you're not telling me. He's just a kid, David. A difficult kid, but still my responsibility." The way she said difficult made my skin crawl. It was the same tone people used when they wanted to justify their cruelty, when they needed to make their victims seem deserving of mistreatment. "If you're worried about him, maybe you should call the police," I said carefully. "I can't do that," she said quickly. Too quickly. "It's complicated. His mother, she left him with me unofficially. There's no paperwork, no legal guardianship. If the authorities get involved..." She trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. If the authorities got involved, they'd ask questions about why she hadn't reported him missing immediately, about the conditions he'd been living in, about the locks on the food cabinets and the makeshift bed in the closet. "I understand," I said, though understanding only made me more determined to protect Tommy. "I'm sure he'll turn up. Kids that age, they sometimes run off when they're upset. He's probably staying with a friend or something." Sarah's expression softened slightly, as if she wanted to believe this narrative. "You think so?" "I think," I said carefully, "that if he felt unwanted or uncared for, he might have decided to find somewhere else to go. Kids are resilient like that. It was a risk, suggesting that Tommy had left because of her treatment of him. But I could see it land, could see her processing the implication, and deciding it was preferable to the alternative explanations. "Yeah," she said finally. "Yeah, you're probably right. He was always complaining about being here, saying he wanted to go back to his mom. Maybe he decided to go look for her." I nodded. Though the casual way she accepted this explanation, the lack of genuine concern for his safety, only reinforced my conviction that I'd made the right choice in keeping him away from her. After Sarah left, I found Tommy sitting on his bed, knees drawn up to his chest in his familiar defensive posture. He looked up at me with wide eyes, and I could see the fear there, the old terror of being discovered and dragged back to a situation he couldn't survive. "What did she say?" he asked. "She wanted to know if I'd seen you." I told her I hadn't. "Did she believe you?" I sat down on the edge of his bed, choosing my words carefully. "I think she wants to believe that you left on your own, that you went to look for your mother. It's easier for her than admitting she lost track of you." Tommy nodded slowly, processing this information. What happens now? It was the question I'd been avoiding, the one that would determine the course of both our lives. I could continue to hide him, to provide temporary shelter while hoping his mother would return or Sarah would have a change of heart. Or I could take the more difficult path, the one that would require involving authorities and navigating legal complexities I didn't fully understand. "Now," I said, "we figure out how to make this permanent, how to make sure you're safe and cared for, legally and officially." "You mean like adoption?" Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe. Or guardianship or foster care through someone who actually wants to take care of you. There are options, Tommy. We just have to find the right one." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up at me again, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Would you want to adopt me?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with hope and fear, and the weight of everything that had brought us to this moment. I thought about my comfortable, uncomplicated life, about the ways it would change if I said yes. I thought about the legal battles ahead, the questions from social workers and family court judges, the scrutiny that would come with formally taking responsibility for a child who wasn't mine. But mostly I thought about Tommy, about the way he'd eaten those first pancakes, savoring each bite, about how he'd helped me with small tasks around the apartment, always asking if he was doing it right, always afraid of making a mistake, about the sound of his laughter the night before, when we'd watched a comedy together and he'd forgotten, for a moment, to be afraid. "Yes," I said. "I would." The words seemed to surprise us both. Tommy's face lit up with a joy so pure it made my chest ache, and I realized I'd been holding my breath, waiting for my own answer. "Really?" he asked. "Really. It won't be easy, and it might take time, but yes. I want to be your family, Tommy, if you'll have me." He launched himself into my arms then, hugging me with the fierce desperation of someone who'd been drowning and had finally found solid ground. I held him tightly, feeling the thin frame of his body, the way he trembled with emotion and relief. "I love you," he whispered against my shoulder. "I love you too, kiddo." I whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of my being. The next morning I called a family law attorney. Then I called Child Protective Services. I explained the situation as clearly as I could, emphasizing Tommy's neglect and abandonment, his fear of returning to his aunt, my willingness to provide him with a safe home while the legal process played out. The social worker who came to interview us was a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd clearly seen too many cases like Tommy's. She asked him gentle questions about his living situation with Sarah, about his mother's absence, about how he felt staying with me. Tommy answered honestly, describing the locked food cabinets and the closet bed, the way Sarah had called him a burden and threatened to tell his mother he'd run away. He also talked about the safety he felt in my apartment, the regular meals and the bed with clean sheets, the way I'd helped him with his reading and never made him feel like he was too much trouble. "You understand," Mrs. Rodriguez said to me after Tommy had gone to his room, "that this is a complicated situation. There's no documentation of abuse, no legal guardianship arrangements, no clear path forward. The biological mother has legal rights, regardless of her current absence. I understand, I said. But I also understand that Tommy needs stability and care, and I'm prepared to provide that for as long as it takes. She studied me for a long moment, then made a note in her file. We'll need to do a full background check, home inspection, psychological evaluation. If you're serious about this, Mr. Chen, you need to be prepared for a long process. I'm serious, I said, and I'm prepared. The legal process was indeed long and complicated. There were forms to fill out, interviews to endure, home visits from social workers who needed to verify that I could provide a safe environment for a child. My own childhood experiences were scrutinized, my financial situation examined, my references contacted. Through it all, Tommy remained with me. The court granted me temporary guardianship while the case worked its way through the system, partly because no one else was stepping forward to claim him. His mother had vanished completely, and Sarah had made it clear she didn't want him back. "Good riddance," she'd said when the social worker interviewed her. I tried to help, but he was too much work, always eating, always needing something. I have my own life to live. The casual cruelty of her words, the way she spoke about a child as if he were a burden she'd been unfairly saddled with, only strengthened my resolve. Whatever it took, however long it took, I would make sure Tommy never had to depend on someone who saw him as an inconvenience. Months passed. Tommy started school in the fall, and I watched him slowly begin to trust that this stability was real, that he wouldn't be yanked away from friends and teachers and routines he'd grown to love. He made friends, joined the school's art club, started talking about what he wanted to be when he grew up with the confidence of someone who believed he'd have a future. The adoption was finalized on a cold Tuesday in February, almost exactly 1 year after Sarah had first knocked on my door, asking me to feed her cat. Tommy wore a new shirt I'd bought him for the occasion, and his hair was neatly combed, but he couldn't stop fidgeting with excitement. "Do you, David Chen, promise to love, protect, and care for Thomas Rodriguez as your own son?" the judge asked. "I do," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "And do you, Thomas, want David to be your father?" "Yes," Tommy said, his voice ringing clear through the courtroom. "Yes, I do." The judge smiled as she signed the papers. "Then congratulations. You are now legally father and son." Tommy launched himself into my arms, and I held him tightly, feeling the weight of responsibility and love and hope for the future. We were a family now, officially and permanently, bonded not by blood but by choice and commitment and the kind of love that grows from truly seeing and caring for another person. As we left the courthouse, Tommy slipped his hand into mine. "Dad," he said, testing out the word, "can we go get ice cream?" "Of course we can," I said. "We can do whatever you want." He smiled up at me, and I saw in his face the child he'd always been meant to be, confident and loved and free from the fear that had defined his early years. It had taken a simple request to feed a cat to bring us together, but it had taken everything we both had to build the family we'd become. That evening, as we sat in our living room, Tommy working on homework while I prepared dinner, I thought about the strange paths that led us to the people we're meant to love. A year ago, I'd been a man living alone, comfortable in my solitude, convinced that my life was full enough without the complications of caring for another person. Now I couldn't imagine my life without Tommy's presence, without the sound of his laughter filling the apartment, without the satisfaction of helping him grow into the person he was meant to be. He'd taught me that love wasn't just about finding someone who needed you, but about discovering that being needed could transform you into someone better than you'd ever imagined you could be. "Dad?" Tommy said, looking up from his math homework. "Do you think we'll ever see Sarah again?" I considered the question carefully. We'd heard through neighbors that she'd moved out of the apartment next door, leaving no forwarding address. Whiskers had been taken to a shelter, though I'd made sure he found a good home with a family who would actually care for him. I don't know, I said honestly. Would you want to? Tommy thought about this for a moment, his pencil poised over his worksheet. Maybe someday, he said finally, just to show her that I turned out okay, that I wasn't really a burden after all. You were never a burden, I said firmly. Not to me, not to anyone who matters. He smiled and returned to his homework, and I went back to preparing dinner, thinking about the resilience of children, about their capacity to forgive and hope and grow beyond the circumstances that tried to define them. Later that night, after Tommy had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, looking through the photo album we'd started together. Pictures of his first day at his new school, his birthday party, Christmas morning, all the ordinary moments that make up a life lived in safety and love. I thought about the boy I'd found crying in Sarah's closet, holding his stomach and trying to make himself invisible. That boy still existed somewhere inside the confident, happy child, sleeping in the next room. But he was no longer defined by fear and neglect. He'd learned that he was worthy of love, that he deserved care and attention and a place in the world. And I'd learned something too. I'd learned that the life I'd built in careful isolation, the comfortable distance I'd maintained from the messiness of human connection, had been a kind of prison. Opening my heart to Tommy had opened it to possibilities I'd never imagined, had shown me that love wasn't a burden to be avoided, but a gift to be embraced. The sound of Tommy's door opening interrupted my thoughts. He appeared in the doorway, hair mussed from sleep, looking younger than his 10 years in his oversized pajamas. Dad? I had a bad dream. Do you want to talk about it? I asked, making room for him on the couch. He curled up beside me, leaning against my arm. I dreamed that I was back in the closet, and no one could find me. I was calling for you, but you couldn't hear me. I wrapped my arm around him, feeling the familiar protectiveness that had become as natural as breathing. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Promise? He asked, the way children do when they need absolute certainty. Promise, I said. You're stuck with me forever. He giggled at that, the sound chasing away the last shadows of his nightmare. Good. I like being stuck with you. We sat together in comfortable silence, watching the city lights twinkle beyond our window. Tommy's breathing grew deeper and more regular, and I knew he was drifting back to sleep, safe and loved and free from the fear that had once defined his existence. I thought about the moment that had started it all. Sarah's desperate request to feed her cat while she dealt with a family emergency. Such a simple thing, the kind of favor neighbors do for each other without thinking twice. But it had led to this, to a family formed in the most unlikely circumstances, to love grown from the ashes of neglect and abandonment. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives come disguised as ordinary requests, as small acts of kindness that ripple outward in ways we never could have predicted. I'd agreed to feed a cat, and in doing so, I'd found my son. I'd opened my door to help a neighbor, and in return, I'd discovered a love that had transformed everything I thought I knew about myself and what I was capable of. Tommy stirred in his sleep, murmuring something I couldn't quite catch. I smoothed his hair back from his forehead, marveling at how peaceful he looked, how different from the frightened boy I'd found hiding in a closet almost 2 years ago. Thank you, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to him, to the universe, or to the strange chain of events that had brought us together. Outside, the city continued its restless movement. Millions of people living their separate lives, most of them unaware of the small miracles happening behind closed doors, the families being formed in the most unexpected ways. I carried Tommy back to his bed, tucking him in with the same care I'd once thought was beyond me. As I turned off his light, he mumbled sleepily, "Love you, Dad." "Love you too, kiddo," I whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of my being. The next morning brought the familiar routine we'd established over the past year. Tommy helped me make breakfast, chattering about his plans for the day, his excitement about an art project he was working on at school. The easy domesticity of it still amazed me sometimes. How natural it had become to have another person's needs and wants woven into the fabric of my daily life. "Dad," he said as he buttered his toast, "can Jason come over after school today? We want to work on our science project together." "Of course," I said, already mentally adjusting my work schedule to accommodate having another child in the apartment. "What's the project about?" "Animal behavior," Tommy said, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "We're studying how different animals adapt to their environments. I wanted to include something about cats, about how they're survivors." I smiled at the unconscious poetry of his choice. "That sounds like a great topic. Very relevant." After Tommy left for school, I settled into my home office, but I found it hard to concentrate on work. My mind kept drifting to the anniversary that was approaching. 2 years since that first knock on my door. 2 years since my life had changed in ways I never could have imagined. I'd been thinking about doing something special to mark the occasion. Maybe taking Tommy on a trip or having a party with his friends. But as I sat there, looking at the framed photo of us from his adoption day, I realized that the real celebration was in the ordinary moments. The daily routine of caring for someone who mattered more to me than my own life. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, the social worker who'd handled Tommy's case. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice warmer than it had been during those first difficult months. "I hope you don't mind me calling. I have some news about Tommy's case." My heart skipped a beat. Even though the adoption had been finalized, I still felt a flutter of anxiety whenever anyone from the system contacted me. "What kind of news?" "His biological mother has been found," she said. "She's been living in another state and she's indicated that she'd like to make contact." The words hit me like a physical blow. Tommy's mother, who had abandoned him without a word, who had left him to suffer in Sarah's care, now wanted back into his life. The protective instinct that had driven me to take him in the first place flared to life, stronger than ever. "What exactly does that mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's asking for visitation rights," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. "She claims she never intended to abandon him permanently, that she was dealing with her own mental health issues and needed time to get stable." I felt a familiar rage building, the same anger I'd felt when I'd first discovered Tommy hiding in that closet. And where was this concern for his well-being when she left him with someone who was neglecting him? Where was it when he was sleeping in a closet and going without food? "I understand your feelings, Mr. Chen," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "But legally, she still has parental rights. The fact that you've adopted Tommy doesn't erase her biological connection to him." "What does Tommy know about this?" I asked, already dreading the conversation I'd have to have with him. "Nothing yet. I wanted to speak with you first, to discuss how to approach this situation. The court will likely order a psychological evaluation, both of Tommy and his mother, to determine what's in his best interest." After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the wall. I thought about Tommy, about how far he'd come, about the stability and security he'd found in our life together. The idea of disrupting that, of forcing him to confront the woman who had abandoned him when he needed her most, made me feel sick. But I also knew that running from this wouldn't solve anything. Tommy deserved to know the truth, to have a voice in whatever decision was made about his future. He'd been powerless for too long, shuffled between adults who treated him as an inconvenience rather than a person with his own needs and feelings. When Tommy came home from school that afternoon, I could see immediately that something was wrong. His usual chatter was replaced by a quiet tension, and he kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "How was school?" I asked, settling beside him on the couch. "Fine," he said, but his voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. You can ask me anything." He was quiet for a moment, picking at a loose thread on his backpack. "Jason's mom asked me about my real parents today. She wanted to know if I ever missed them. If I ever wanted to see them again." My heart clenched. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were my real dad," he said, looking up at me with fierce certainty. "I told her that the people who had me before didn't take care of me. But you do. Was that okay?" I pulled him into a hug, feeling the familiar swell of love and protectiveness. "That was perfect, Tommy. You're absolutely right. But," he continued, his voice muffled against my shoulder, "it made me think about them, about my mom, and where she went, and why she left me with Sarah." I took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment I had been dreading. "Tommy, I got a phone call today. About your mother." He pulled back to look at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "Is she okay?" "She's alive and she's asking to see you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Tommy's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, excitement, fear, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Does she want me back?" he asked quietly. It was the question I'd been dreading most, the one that cut to the heart of his deepest insecurities. "I don't know what she wants exactly, but I need you to know that no matter what happens, no matter what she says or wants, you are my son. Your home, Tommy? This is your home." He nodded slowly, processing this information. "Can I think about it? About whether I want to see her?" "Of course you can. And whatever you decide, I'll support you. If you want to see her, I'll be there with you. If you don't want to see her, that's okay too." That night, Tommy was quieter than usual. He picked at his dinner, gave short answers to my questions, and went to bed early. I could hear him moving around in his room, restless and unsettled, and it took all my willpower not to go in and try to fix whatever he was feeling. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Tommy would seem fine for stretches of time, laughing at something on TV or getting excited about a project at school. But then he'd retreat into himself, lost in thoughts he wasn't ready to share. I found myself watching him more closely, looking for signs of regression, for any indication that the news about his mother was undoing the progress he'd made. But what I saw instead was a boy trying to process complex emotions, working through questions that would be difficult for anyone, much less a child. A week after Mrs. Rodriguez's call, Tommy came to me with a decision. "I want to see her," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes. "I want to ask her why she left me." I felt my heart break a little at the simple honesty of his words. "Are you sure?" "You don't have to do this, Tommy. You don't owe her anything." "I know," he said, "but I need to know. I need to understand why she thought it was okay to leave me with someone who didn't want me." The meeting was arranged for the following week, in a neutral location with Mrs. Rodriguez present. Tommy's mother, Linda, was a thin woman with Tommy's dark hair and tired eyes. She looked nervous as we entered the room, fidgeting with her hands and avoiding eye contact. "Tommy," she said when she saw him, her voice breaking slightly, "you've grown so much." Tommy stood beside me, holding my hand tightly. "Hi, Mom." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult I'd ever witnessed. Linda tried to explain her absence, talking about depression and addiction, and feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for a child. She spoke about getting help, about being in a better place now, about wanting to be part of Tommy's life again. Tommy listened quietly, occasionally asking questions that were heartbreaking in their simplicity. "Why didn't you come back for me? Why didn't you call?" "Did you know Sarah was mean to me?" Linda's answers were inadequate, full of excuses and self-justification. She claimed she'd thought Tommy would be better off with Sarah, that she'd planned to come back once she got her life together. She seemed genuinely surprised when Tommy described the conditions he'd lived in, the neglect and emotional abuse he'd endured. "I didn't know," she kept saying. "I thought she was taking care of you. I thought you were okay. But you didn't check," Tommy said, his voice small but steady. "You didn't call or visit or anything. You just left me there." The meeting ended with Linda asking for regular visitation, claiming she wanted to rebuild their relationship. Tommy listened to her request with the same careful attention he'd given to her explanations, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. Afterward, as we drove home, Tommy was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "She's not better, is she?" he asked. "She's still the same person who left me." I chose my words carefully. "What do you think?" "I think she's sorry that things were hard for her. But she's not really sorry about what happened to me. She kept talking about how difficult it was for her to be a mom. But she never said she was sorry for leaving me in a bad place." His insight was devastating in its accuracy. Linda had spent most of the meeting focused on her own struggles, her own journey toward recovery, with little acknowledgement of the trauma she'd caused her son. "What do you want to do?" I asked. Tommy was quiet for another long moment. "I want to tell the judge that I don't want to see her anymore. I want to tell them that you're my real dad now, and that I don't need her to be okay." The hearing was scheduled for the following month. Tommy testified with a maturity that broke my heart, explaining clearly and calmly why he didn't want ongoing contact with his biological mother. He talked about feeling safe and loved in our home, about not wanting to be pulled back into the chaos and uncertainty that had defined his early years. "She says she's better now," he told the judge. "But she said she'd come back before, and she didn't. I don't want to keep waiting for her to be the mom I need. I already have a dad who takes care of me." The judge listened carefully to Tommy's testimony, to the reports from social workers and psychologists, to Linda's pleas for another chance. In the end, she ruled that while Linda would retain her parental rights, visitation would be limited to supervised meetings twice a year, with the understanding that Tommy's needs and preferences would be given primary consideration. Linda was devastated by the decision, but I felt only relief. Tommy had been given a voice in his own future, and he'd used it to choose stability and love over the false promise of reconciliation with someone who had already proven herself unreliable. As we left the courthouse, Tommy slipped his hand into mine. "Are you proud of me?" he asked. "I'm so proud of you," I said, squeezing his hand. "You were brave and honest and strong. You stood up for yourself and for what you need." "I learned that from you," he said simply. "You showed me that I deserve to be taken care of." That evening we celebrated with ice cream and his favorite movie, a quiet acknowledgement of the chapter we'd just closed. Tommy seemed lighter somehow, as if making the decision about his mother had freed him from a burden he'd been carrying without fully understanding its weight. "Dad," he said as we were getting ready for bed, "do you think I'll ever want to see her again? When I'm older?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Your feelings might change as you grow up, but whatever you decide, whenever you decide it, I'll support you." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad I saw her. I'm glad I got to ask her my questions. But I'm also glad I get to stay with you." "I'm glad too," I said, tucking him in. "More glad than I can even explain." As I turned off his light, Tommy called out to me one more time. "Dad, thank you for saving me." "Thank you for saving me too," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. 2 years later, Tommy was 12 years old, confident and happy, excelling in school, and surrounded by friends who'd never known him as anything other than David Chen's son. He'd grown taller, His face had lost some of its childish roundness, but he still had that same earnest intensity that had struck me when I'd first found him hiding in Sarah's closet. We'd settled into a comfortable routine, the kind of ordinary family life that had once seemed impossibly foreign to me. Tommy played soccer, took art classes, helped me with grocery shopping and dinner preparation. He'd never expressed interest in seeing his biological mother again, though we'd maintained the twice-yearly supervised visits, as ordered by the court. It was on one of these visit days that Linda failed to show up. Mrs. Rodriguez called to explain that Linda had missed her scheduled appointment, that she'd been dealing with some personal issues and wasn't ready for the meeting. "How do you want to handle this with Tommy?" she asked. "Let me talk to him," I said. "He deserves to know." When I told Tommy about his mother's absence, he was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "I'm not really surprised," he said. "She's still doing the same thing she always did. How do you feel about that?" I asked. "Honestly, I feel okay. I used to think that if she got better, if she really changed, maybe we could have a relationship, but I don't think she's going to change, and I don't need her to anymore." That was the last time Linda requested visitation. She faded from our lives as quietly as she'd tried to re-enter them, leaving Tommy free to continue growing into the remarkable young man he was becoming. On the 4th anniversary of the day I'd first found Tommy in Sarah's apartment, we decided to do something special. We volunteered at a local shelter, helping to serve meals to families in crisis. Tommy had suggested it, saying he wanted to help other kids who might be going through what he'd experienced. "It feels good to help people," he told me as we cleaned up after the meal service. "It makes me feel like something good came from all the bad stuff that happened to me." As we walked home that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. 4 years ago, I'd been a man living in comfortable isolation, convinced that my life was full enough without the complications of caring for another person. Now I couldn't imagine my existence without Tommy's presence, without the daily joy of watching him grow and learn and become more fully himself. "Dad," Tommy said as we reached our building, "I was thinking about something." "What's that?" "I want to change my name. Legally, I mean. I want to be Tommy Chen, not Tommy Rodriguez." I stopped walking, surprised by the request. "You don't have to do that, Tommy. You're my son, regardless of what your name is." "I know," he said, "but I want to. I want people to know that we're family, that we belong together. Plus, Rodriguez was never really my name anyway. It was just something the system gave me. Chen is the name I chose." The legal process to change Tommy's name was relatively simple. Just paperwork and fees, and a brief hearing. But the emotional impact was profound. Watching him sign Thomas Chen for the first time, seeing his face light up with pride and belonging, I felt the same overwhelming love I'd experienced on the day his adoption was finalized. "There," he said, holding up the official document. "Now it's official. I'm Tommy Chen, and you're my dad, and we're a real family." "We were always a real family," I said, but I understood what he meant. Sometimes the official recognition of something that already exists in your heart makes it feel more permanent, more protected from the uncertainties of the world. That night, as we sat in our living room, Tommy working on homework while I prepared dinner, I thought about the strange miracle of our connection. We'd found each other through circumstances that should have been tragic. A child's neglect and abandonment, leading to a bond that had transformed both of our lives. I thought about the boy I'd been, growing up feeling unwanted and burdensome, and the man I'd become, someone who'd learned to love and be loved in return. I thought about Tommy, who'd survived neglect and emotional abuse to become someone capable of joy and trust and generosity. "Dad," Tommy said, looking up from his math homework, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if Sarah had never asked you to feed her cat?" It was a question I'd asked myself countless times over the years. What do you think would have happened? I think, he said thoughtfully, that we would have found each other some other way. Maybe not right away, but eventually. I think we were supposed to be a family. I smiled at his certainty, at the faith he had in the rightness of our connection. I think you might be right about that. I know I'm right, he said with the confidence of a 12-year-old who'd learned to trust his own judgment. We fit together. We make each other better. As I watched him return to his homework, I marveled at the wisdom of children, at their ability to see essential truths that adults often miss. We did fit together, in ways that had nothing to do with biology or legal documents. We'd found in each other what we'd both been missing, the security of being truly known and loved. The sound of rain against the windows created a cozy atmosphere in our apartment, and I felt the deep contentment that comes from being exactly where you're meant to be. 4 years ago, I'd agreed to feed a neighbor's cat, a simple favor that had seemed insignificant at the time. Now I understood that there are no insignificant moments, no small acts of kindness that don't ripple outward in ways we can't predict. That knock on my door had been the beginning of the most important relationship of my life, the start of a family formed not by accident of birth but by choice, commitment, and the kind of love that grows stronger with each passing day. Tommy looked up from his homework and smiled at me, and in that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles we might face, we would meet them together. We were father and son, not by blood, but by something deeper than blood. We were family, in the truest sense of the word. I love you, Dad, he said, the words as natural as breathing. I love you too, Tommy, I replied, and meant it with every fiber of my being. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean and preparing the way for whatever tomorrow might bring. But inside our apartment, in the warmth of our shared life, we were home.